Now let's start the part of the lesson where we look at punctuation. Punctuation is kind of difficult in the English language. It's easy to make mistakes in punctuation. There's no way I can cover everything, and I can't teach you all of the rules of punctuation. So what I can do instead is show you some examples of common punctuation errors and how those punctuation errors can be repaired. So one of the common mistakes that we see with punctuation in scientific writing would be missing commas. So here's a sentence that says, the mechanism can be exploited to facilitate, for example, gene tagging or introduction of point mutations at endogenous loci by co-delivery of a repair template that harbors this specific feature. There are no commas in that sentence. So we use a comma before certain words like which or thus, or we use them after certain words like however or therefore, or we can use them when we want the reader to pause within the sentence. I would revise this sentence as such. The mechanism can be exploited to facilitate, for example, gene tagging or introduction of point mutations at endogenous loci by co-delivery of a repair template. So I've set apart the phrase, for example, with commas, so a comma before and a comma after. And then I've also set apart the example phrase with commas, gene tagging or introduction of point mutations at endogenous loci. So having those commas is going to help your reader read this sentence and make it grammatically correct. Now sometimes authors will put in unnecessary commas, commas that are not needed. So an example would be like this. The high costs of feeding for predator species are determined mainly by the difficulties of finding, handling, attacking, and ingesting the prey. So those first 4 commas are not necessary. They shouldn't be there. They make the reader pause, but the pauses don't really have any purpose. I would just eliminate those first 4 commas. The ones in the list are necessary, and so we'll leave those as they are. Here's an example of a sentence that has both extra commas and missing commas. So honeybees, Apis mellifera, comma, are critical for agricultural ecosystems, but are exposed to many biotic stressors, including bacteria, viruses, and fungi. And I read that as if the commas were there. They should be, but they're not. So the first comma is not necessary. Just say honeybees are critical for agricultural ecosystems. There's no reason to pause and say honeybees are critical for agricultural ecosystems. That's not how we should do it. But there are 2 missing commas later in the sentence. Before you get to the examples where the phrase says including bacteria, viruses, and fungi, you need a comma before you get to that example phrase. And we also need a comma before the and in the last item of a list. This is called the Oxford comma. In this case, the Oxford comma is after viruses in the phrase that says including bacteria, viruses, and fungi. If you don't include that Oxford comma, then viruses and fungi looks like it's one term. So it would say including bacteria, viruses, and fungi. That just doesn't work very well. So I highly recommend using this Oxford comma. Now I'd like to illustrate the importance of commas with an example that's not a scientific writing example. It's kind of a fun example, and I saw this somewhere. So here is how misplaced or missing commas can change the entire meaning of a sentence. We have the phrase, I like cooking my friends and my pets. That means whoever is saying the sentence likes to cook their friends and they like to cook their pets. And that is, highly illegal and unethical and repulsive. Now, if you have 1 comma, it says, I like cooking my friends and my pets. That means that the speaker is addressing their friends and their pets. Now, if you have the second comma, I like cooking my friends and my pets. Now it means it's a list. The person likes to cook, the person likes their friends, and the person likes their pets. So the third version is the correct version of the sentence, and you can see how missing 1 or 2 of the commas completely changes the meaning of the sentence. One of the things to keep in mind for using commas is that when you have an adjective clause, it needs to be set apart with the commas when it's modifying the noun that the adjective refers to, but not when it is defining the noun that the adjective refers to. So the correct way to do this would be the samples that were collected at the first time point were analyzed by RT-PCR, while the samples that were collected at the later time point were analyzed by RNA-seq. That is correct because we have two that phrases. That phrases are defining, as we learned earlier when we talked about that versus which. With these defining phrases, we don't use the commas. It would be incorrect to write it this way. The samples, comma, that were collected at the first time point, comma, were analyzed by RT-PCR, while the samples, comma, that were collected at the later time point, comma, were analyzed by RNA-seq. Again, because these adjective clauses are defining, they're not modifying. Another common comma error that you'll find frequently in scientific writing is called the comma splice. And this is when two sentences are connected by a comma instead of being separated by a period. A comma splice is usually used when the author wants the reader to quickly read the next sentence. So here's an example of the comma splice. We selected 48 mice at random, comma. They were assigned to 4 treatments. It should say, we selected 48 mice at random, period. They were assigned to 4 treatments, because it's 2 separate sentences. So don't join them with a comma. That's a comma splice. Another example is this. HO and HS are geographically close, approximately 20 kilometers, and have similar genetic structures, comma. They should be grouped as a single management unit. All right, so that comma splice needs to be corrected, but how should we correct it? There's 2 different ways that I can see. The first one is to say, since HO and HS are geographically close, approximately 20 kilometers, and have similar genetic structures, comma, they should be grouped as a single management unit. We still have the comma there, but because we've added the word since to the beginning of this sentence, now it works. The other way we could do it is just make it 2 separate sentences by adding a period instead of a comma and a transition word, therefore, at the beginning of the second sentence. Now, semicolons are a piece of punctuation that are pretty useful, but they're often used incorrectly in scientific writing. If you're going to use them, make sure you know how to use them correctly. Semicolons should be used before a clause. They shouldn't be used like a splice comma, or shouldn't be used like a comma. So an example of a way to not use the semicolon correctly is in this sentence. We harmonized the probes across the platforms by determining the probe sequences from different annotation files for each platform, semicolon, renumbering the probes on the basis of unique probe sequences. That's not the proper use of the semicolon. We should replace it with a comma and a word that explains the sequence here. We harmonized the probes across the platforms by determining the probe sequences from the different annotation files for each platform, then renumbering the probes on the basis of unique probe sequences. Now, we're at the last topic for this lesson, and I want to talk about spelling and grammar. I think it goes without saying that you need to use correct spelling and correct grammar in scientific writing. So why am I even bringing this up? I'm bringing this up because it is so important that when you're editing, you need to really be careful and be detail-oriented to make sure that you're not making spelling mistakes and grammar mistakes. So make sure you use a spell checker when you write your document. The problem with the spell checker is there are a lot of scientific words that are not in the spell checker, and it will pick them up as spelling errors. And so it's kind of annoying to use a spell checker because so many words come up and you have to sort through those, but it will find your spelling errors. One thing you can do is add all your scientific terms to the spell checker's glossary so that it doesn't bring those up as misspellings. You can also consider using a grammar checker So there are free grammar checkers out there on the internet that you can download, or Microsoft Word has a built-in grammar checker that catches a lot of grammatical errors. They're not perfect, and you still have to make some judgment calls. Sometimes the grammar checkers will flag things as grammatical errors, but you don't want to change it because it's going to change the meaning. So it's not necessarily an error, even if it comes up as one. So you can't just blindly accept all the results of the grammar checker, but do consider using one. And also try to have an outside reader. So your co-authors should be catching any of these grammar or spelling mistakes, but they might not. So you might also consider getting someone else to read your work, a friend or a colleague from a slightly different field that's not going to be focused on the science, and they can pay attention to the writing. Now I'd like to show you an example that I came across a few years ago when I was writing a paper, and I was reading a related paper to use in the introduction or the discussion of my paper. And I came across this sentence. It says, for the population, Fro2, a proton with reductase activity interacts with cytochrome P450 like proteins. So because this is my field, I recognize that this sentence had a lot of errors in it. Even if it's not your field, you can recognize some of these errors. The first phrase, for the population, what population are they talking about? And what do they mean, for the population? And then it says Fro2 is a proton with reductase activity. If you know what a proton is, it doesn't make sense that a proton has reductase activity. And what kind of reductase activity? There are thousands of kinds of reductase activities. And what does it mean it interacts with cytochrome P450 like proteins? It interacts with cytochrome P450 like proteins interact with cytochrome P450 is the way that reads, but that doesn't really make sense either. And so what I would do with this sentence if I had the opportunity to correct it is I would say mapped in the X population was Fro2, a protein, not a proton, a protein that has ferric chelate reductase activity and that interacts with cytochrome P450 like proteins. So it needs to have that dash there, P450 like. And that's a completely different meaning than without the dash. Well, that brings us to the conclusion of this lesson. I'd like to reiterate the learning outcomes as we wrap it up. And so after this lesson, you will be able to recognize common errors in sentences. You'll be able to explain why they are errors, and you'll be able to correct these common errors. As you put these lessons into practice and edit your own writing and practice on other writing that you find in the literature, I hope you enjoy the process. And as you continue writing your manuscripts and grant proposals, happy writing.